Welcome back. So this week we're going to be looking at chapter 10 of Nagaratnama's book and then chapters 7 and 8 of Muthulakshmi Reddy. So we'll, as usual, start with the summaries. So Santosh, would you like to go ahead? Okay.
You can start with the Nagaratnama's thing and I can go to the last chapter of Muthulakshmi. That's fine.
So this week, instead of a chronological summary, I decided to pick a few themes, highlights that stood out to me across both chapters of these books. And then maybe that could be a starting point for us to think about the different issues that it raises. So chapter 10 of Nagaratnama's book, we're told about her dreams and her wishes for the trust that she sets up and the future of what she wants with Yagaraja Aradhana to be. So she makes arrangements, sets up a trust in her own name, and makes arrangements for the continuance of the Yagaraja Aradhana festival in Tiruvayara. And we're also told of her own so we're also told of what happens thereafter. So after her death, unfortunately, there are issues with how the trust is managed. After the death of the trustees, she appoints, and this takes on a different direction. So we're also told of how, gives us a glimpse of how she spent her final days in this chapter of spending it with the Aradhana, with Tyagaraja, and devoted to his cause. She built her own. She wanted her own funeral and her last resting place next to his, and she spends her last years in quiet, almost entirely dedicated to this cause. So to me, across the chapters of the books of both Muthulakshmi Reddy and the chapter 7, Devadasi problem that we read, it really highlighted to me the interesting role of caste and class and in the ways this interacted. So we're told in page 142 of the Muthulakshmi Reddy book, for instance, where she says, the historian S. Anandi, she comments on this, and she says the idea that Devadasi might be materially downsized because of this legislation prevented was the reason they were opposing the abolishment of the system. And they characterize Muthulakshmi Reddy as needing to help the other impoverished women from this community who needed an alternative means. So they needed a wider horizon to pursue different things. And so her bill really supported that. And they also characterize the men who oppose this bill as only being concerned with the culture, where women were expected to retain a traditional culture, dress traditionally, and be authentic, while men could venture into this modernity. So that for me raised questions of what modernity means in this context, and perhaps the motivations that and the fractions that perhaps occurred within the women of this community who were affluent versus perhaps others, and particularly the role the way the abolishment movement were played in this dynamic. So we're also told that this chapter also highlighted or characterized Muthulakshmi Reddy's opposition for the bill as a vocabulary of the moment, her references to the Devadasis as victims of a particular system, and particularly asked us to think about perhaps what that served at the time. So here in page 141, there's a quotation where it says there was no particular status in concubinage, and the much vaunted agency of the professional courtesan may have only been a way for her to assert such independence and dignity as they could salvage from a fundamentally iniquitous arrangement. The arts flourished as they did is a tribute to the character and spirit of men and women who did not have other opportunities. That was to me interesting to what role or what level of agency did they have, and particularly we know about at least some of these personalities. For instance, Nagaratnama, in her book, was she working with what was a fundamentally inequitous arrangement? How much of agency did she have, and how much of agency perhaps was there in a more traditional role? And the degrees, I guess, of choice that comes to play there. What also was interesting to me in the Devadasi chapter in Muthulakshmi Reddy's book was the description of by historian K. Sadashivam, he defined the Devadasi system as that it characterized it as something that began to decline about the 15th century. And he cites frequent transfers between temples, a graded hierarchy amongst the women themselves, and he says there was a perpetual watch over them, perpetual surveillance. So this for me again was interesting because I've heard other accounts, for instance, state that the system flourished because of these transfers, that there was a spread of repertoire and of knowledge as a result, as a direct result. And this is often seen as a flourishing of the system where it was particularly popular and in demand. So I thought that was interesting. And so there's also referred to representations of the Sevelalar Sangam in Tanjavur and Mayagaram and Telugu Kulavantalu meetings in Pelagri, who wrote, we're told, in support of Muthulakshmi Reddy and her abolishment movement. This book was interesting because typically, at least the other chapter, we were told that Devadasi, there was very powerful groups of the Devadasi women were opposed to the bill, and here we're given perhaps sources of support. For me, it was interesting whether there is a gender dynamic within this and whether, to what extent this represented the voices, these representations represented the voices of this community. So those are just some of the highlights that I found interesting, but maybe we could discuss further later. So I'll hand it over to Santosh to continue.
Just on the start of the discussions that happened in the caste-based system and caste-based divisions that were very much highlighted, I think that continued with the chapter Shelter of Love as well. And it was quite evident as to why the school or the home that she mentioned, the Avai home, sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but then, yeah, so if the Illa or the home, which came into action, which was, which I think towards the end of the chapter, how they mentioned that it was not deliberate, it was not intentional, but it just happened, and it just happened so beautifully, and how things fell in place. And along with that, what was very interesting to see was the code of conduct and the number of aksharas and how it was kind of divided. I was quite interested to understand a bit more of that and to see how it's kind of looked into at this current time as well. So I thought that'll be a good discussion to kind of talk about. And what also got my eyes was talking about the word Avai, which is respectable women, and how they were kind of discussing about the concept of it and how they got in Sangam poetry versus how the poets and discussions were happening. So it was quite interesting to see the concepts and context as to how Reddy was thinking about it and how she was considering these women in their status that they were. So that was very interesting to see, and I found that a further read to it would be very, very nice to open up. And I think what was also interesting within the context was how visitors like Sarojini Naidu and Margaret Cousins, when they were there, how these girls had entertained them, but then the word entertainment was used very differently in the context there, and how they were supported in their learning, which was very interesting, even if they used the word entertainment. So it was that I found very interesting as well. And also with the numbers increasing, how Reddy addressed it with the land, and how the temples those days were not ready to sell it, but then they had this concept of lease, which I don't know, at least in Hyderabad, I've seen that that's not something that usually they give in very freely, but then I don't know if it is state-wise. So it's like they don't lease out the land like that, but it was very interesting to see how that was leased and how another land I found that a very beautiful move where she had 27 grounds, which were one on her name and the other was on the home's name. And then she had a point where she could use it for the recurring 50 years as well, which I found a very beautiful way how she had connected to this. And what I also felt interesting was the partnership with National Center for Teaching, Education and Training, which is very important part of their development and growth, and how she used language within their concepts to the regional language diploma in regional languages, which I also found very much mapped to the code of conduct. There was a paper where I think I'll try and share that here, was about the code of conduct versus the regional language literature and how they're kind of connected and things like that. So that was very interesting to see how she had emphasized on that. And towards the end of the chapter, I really like the words of Dr. Krishnamurti, where he says, "Our home was since its inception an unplanned project. It was born under unforeseen emergency." And how he calls the home's development was molded by a number of factors: environmental changes, political transformations, social evolutions, and very importantly, the changing needs of the society. So I think the one very important perspective of Reddy's about the Devadasi and how she's protected or how she's actually, I think the chapter has a very apt title, Shelter of Love. So it just felt like the way she's looked at it, the way she's created a space for them, and the importance of developing their interpersonal skills and their own growth versus everything, and how she's kind of given them leadership qualities, like even to take care of 10 children. There was a senior child, so it was very interesting to see how she had molded them and how she's kind of created a safe space of learning and growing together as well. So this chapter for me was highlighting those qualities, these empathetical qualities of Reddy from a very, very strong perspective, and how she kind of stood in forefront for it. So I think, yeah, that's in the essence of this chapter that I found very interesting.
Uh, I think I read some things that I found interesting from the chapter 7, Shelter of Love, was that she wanted, I think in page 151, I quote, by creating a casteless system, Muthulakshmi thought that the girls, when they passed out of the home, would think about a new social order which did not make caste an important aspect of public life. So I found that very interesting. At the same time, I was also able to, look at the account of her son, Krishnamurti, on how she reacted to her sister's marriage. And I think he says she was a fanatic Puritan, a reaction probably to environment around her childhood at Pudukkottai. And that sometimes her attitude bordered on the tyrannical. I think that says about how a person is not black and white, and where they are and where they grow up, it influences everything that they think about, and the people that they cross paths with. Like, for example, E. Krishna Iyer, his views on the art not to be separated from the system, and her views were different, but in the end, they all wanted the same thing, for people to be benefited and not be used under the name of the culture and uh, religious practices. So even there are very beautiful accounts of the people she meets, and their incidents from their life, like that of Ramamurthy Ammal, and how all of these people came together for the cause of the Devadasi, for acting in with respect to the system. So these are some things that I found very beautiful. And I didn't know about Avaya being a title. I always thought it was one person. It was beautiful and very enlightening to see how the writer has given accounts for all things that she could think of. And maybe, like sort of connected the dots for us.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that in addition to this about the shelter of love part, I think that in the previous chapter, um, I think that's when it becomes very clear, because there's a bit of a parallel between the analysis that's given in that chapter and what was there in the Nagaratnammal book in the very beginning, I think, which was about the Tanjore Periya Koil and how the Devadasi system was not, I'm saying, closer to the 1800s or 1900s, but since the very beginning of this tradition. So I think that few things that struck me were, I think, so there's, I think, overall in general in the community, and also this discourse and debate about the Devadasi system, I think it's brought out quite well in the book. Because, on one side, even I haven't been able to reconcile it myself. And obviously, there are questions of privilege and who's the person that's thinking about this. But on one side of the debate is the fact that, with the system, like Maitrey says, E. Krishna Iyer was in favor of doing away with the ills of the system, but not at the cost of the art form. But I think this is where Muthulakshmi's perspective becomes very clear here, because a lot of it is also lived experience, because of the kind of discrimination that she has personally faced and the things that her mother has been through. So I think that, yeah, the I think not the pros, but the nuances of this Devadasi argument to say that, uh, they it's I think from my biggest takeaway from this chapter is that it's very easy for us to say, the Devadasis were the custodians of the art form, and they did the Kumbharati, for example. They were very uh, respected, and it was a matriarchal society that I think Victorian morals didn't agree with. But I think the real the problems of the system from Muthulakshmi's perspective and her reasoning to fight against it so strongly really came out in this chapter. Because I think as a doctor, uh, all of the she was more exposed to the actual conditions of women in terms of the societies they live in. And I think there were quite a few sentences in the text uh, that spoke about, like, uh, that kind of took me aback, where they say that, this young girl was sold off for like this much money and this much thing, and they were dedicated to the temple and such. So I think there's definitely the issue of lack of agency that is brought out, and in addition to lack of healthcare, bad social conditions, and generally losing the overall sphere of control that one has. So I think that those nuances that one probably doesn't think of, because earlier I never fully understood what the real reasons Muthulakshmi fought for this so strongly at so much personal cost was. But now I think it became clear. And what also became clear was that so much of it was because of the struggle her mom had had. So I think that just tied it together, because otherwise I was not fully convinced of, why is this woman who has so much on her plate? She's such a talented doctor. She's affecting so much change in the public sphere at a time where she's probably the only woman on the floor speaking up. So why does she choose to use her voice for this? I think I finally got a very nuanced answer to that in this chapter, I think.
I totally agree with it. Sorry. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add on to what Anushka said. I agreed with her perspective on this. And I think just going off of that, Muthulakshmi Reddy never wanted to fight against the art itself and the culture of the Devadasi. She just wanted to fight against the stigma associated with it. And again, that's why she probably resonated so highly with it, because her mother was a Devadasi and she came from that background. And so I just want to go back to the quote that was presented in the beginning of chapter 6. It says, or she says rather, any art or culture worth preserving will certainly hold its own against all times and against all conditions. So I think that's what she really wanted to focus on. And she just wanted to remove the stigma associated with the Devadasis, especially because there was a lot of talk about immorality and how that was part of like many communities. The word Devariyal, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I know it's a very negative word, but it was associated with Devadasis for a long time for the most like corrupt, nauseating reasons. So she wanted to fight against that as well. I think that's why she was so what's the word? Was so strong about this opinion.
I totally agree to these discussions, and I really felt what was interesting was over and over in the book, there was this definition of Devadasis retold, reread in some or the other form, which is quite interesting because usually, it's more and more of a reminder when we keep reading, so we totally kind of explicitly understand the word and meaning. But I love the way how it was over and over told, and got it thinking more in deeper layers. So I really loved that aspect when that came up in the book.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think there was some talk in the book of how people probably misconstrued her reasoning behind wanting to fight against the system. I think it said that she wanted to bring women out of the Devadasi world as she thought it would be, or as she thought it would give girls a future free from any negative association. But the real reason was just to fight against the stigma associated with them, because they were very respectable people of the community. I mean, there were a lot of, I think there was also a part in chapter 6 that said that because they were Nitya Sumangalis, they were permanently auspicious women, there were many I guess like regular women who were married that were jealous of them because they could, have all of these or they were more auspicious, I guess. So that was another interesting point that I noted down.
Yeah, but yeah, I think this point of the Nitya Sumangali is, it's, I think, a word that is quite commonly used with the Devadasis. And this is again that analysis that the author gave, I thought was quite amazing, because at once the author is telling us why I think at the surface level, like the way I understood it earlier was that the Devadasis being Nitya Sumangalis and this title being something that's coveted by so many other women is the reason Devadasis are special and they're sacred and they're a certain like they're not just regular women, they're respected and they have an occupation of their own and they're matriarchal and everything else. But I think that that argument and this understanding of ours is like the author kind of calls that out and talks about Muthulakshmi's perspective here, which is that the reasoning behind why the Devadasi was called Nitya Sumangali is because it is impossible for the husband, in this case the deity, to die, right? And they say that the author says that a married woman, when she loses her husband, becomes a Sumangali, which means that this whole concept of Sumangali, which is pious and auspicious, that we attribute to the Devadasis by virtue of them being Devadasis, is actually not because of that, but it's because of their relationship to their husband, who happens to be like someone who is not a person and hence can't die, right? So I think this, her thinking was that she was able to call out this hypocrisy for what it was. And I think this is probably the earliest like zeroth wave of feminism almost, which is that, like you being called Nitya Sumangali or not should not be because of who you're married to, perhaps. Or that's the way that I understood it. But yeah, that specific paragraph, I agree with Bhargavi in that the analysis really came out to quite strongly.
I also wanted to, something that drew my attention was how the code of conduct was bought from a poetry. And I found that, I just found article, which I'm just sharing it here, and I think that was about how the pedagogy and the concept of traditional teaching method was discussed again now, and it's a 2021 article, and I found that very interesting because something that was studied at that time is restudied from today's perspective. So I just thought it was very interesting to see that, especially because I was reading through the code of conduct and I really found that very, very relevant and very important for a moral learning as well. And I thought this paper was kind of rebringing the discussion. So just thought I'd share that here.
Something else that I thought was interesting or haven't read about before was that, or I didn't know that like many people, irrespective of caste or community, could become a Devadasi. I think there was a point in chapter 6 as well where a princess herself submitted, herself to the temple, and her father gave dowry for her to become, I guess, a Devadasi or part of the temple. So I thought that was interesting because I thought only people from that lineage would be able to continue in that legacy. So I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, and I think this kind of ties back to the prologue from the Bangalore Nagaratnamal book where, or maybe it was the first chapter, I don't know, but that's when they talk about how this concept of a Devadasi system earlier at the very onset, like when they talk about, Rajaraja Chola constructed the Periyakoil and he sort of recruited all these Devadasis from different temples. Like that's what this chapter talks about. But I think the other chapter links to this and says that at that point, 2000 years ago, they were a professional guild. And that's all they were. There was no concept of this being something that turned into a caste hierarchy. So I think if I'm not wrong, what happened there was that slowly, because of uh, questions of patronage and the fact that, because of war and plague and things like that happened, the being a Devadasi became a less lucrative uh, job posting as such. So people had to look to other means of finding livelihoods. And in this case, that would be patrons who would already be at the temple and already be acquainted with these Devadasis. And that's when I think uh, it became a professional guild because their daughters would not be brought up by the father. And we know Muthulakshmi was an exception in this case. Like Narayanasamy was a very open-minded man that most people want. So I think the daughter would then eventually land up in the mother's profession, and that's because there was no other nobody else took ownership of the child. And then that's how slowly it became a profession, became a caste, became a related to caste, I think. But earlier it was just a professional guild.
That the characterization really interesting. For me, I think it also raised questions of exactly how we try and define the system at all. So, I mean, if we start, for instance, with the 13th century, what I have read is other sources is that perhaps at this time, the dancers at the temple, like it didn't have the same structure that we see later in the 16th century onwards. So it was not groups of men teaching women who were associated with both temple and the palace. So I guess in between, there's a lack of references or sources that we can go back to because of perhaps the wars and the political instability. So it's hard to establish that it's been a continuous tradition, right, from Rajaraja Chola's period, where there was definitely dancing in temples, to perhaps later periods in the 16th century, the courts, for instance, in the Nayaka period in the Vijayanagara. empire. So, and we're told that that's where it starts taking, like, for instance, Devi Suneji makes this argument in Unfinished Gestures, where it was only at that point in the 16th century that they had started having the system of teaching, and there's documentation of the system of continuous practice. What was interesting, it comes out here, is that, for instance, he characterizes, the historian she mentions here, characterizes this as a degeneration of the system, where they start moving between kingdoms, and they were transferred amongst communities, whereas perhaps so I mean, I guess that's how we read this, whereas Suneji, he characterizes this as the beginning of the system, because most of our repertoire comes from this period, from the Alarib to our Adavis to the Lana, it comes from this period. So I guess it's just how we think about it. Is it this when it began, and this sort of was the way it flourished and spread, or is this more of something that was forced by financial necessity or a lack of patronage? I think thought that was interesting.
Sorry, I'm trying to think of something to say.
Oh yeah, also on the second chapter of this section in Muthulakshmi Reddy, I think that if you ask me what comes to mind immediately, it would be that, I mean, that it's such an amazing chapter, and it really brings out how she's able to walk this absolute tightrope of being all the things that she was and playing all those roles amazingly well, at that time. I think that is definitely brought out. But and they also say, right, like she was a total disciplinarian. At the same time, she was the most loving person they'd ever met, and all of these women that she took into our home, who lived well into their 80s and led meaningful lives through all of this, through this, I think, web of interconnected institutions that she built. I think one of them worked at the Adyar cancer hospital that she set up. And they really, their lives were definitely touched by Muthulakshmi in, to a magnitude that was not small. And I think one of them says that, I remember Rapai home as being one of the most uh, amazing, memorable periods of my life. I thought that was pretty amazing for someone who's like 86 to be saying. And other than that, the part that actually stood out to me was where they say uh, the British Navy or the British, I think, Air Force had had sort of parked themselves somewhere near our home. And I think they were kind of harassing the girls and the women a little bit. Muthulakshmi came to know about this, and she was literally standing outside our home overnight with a stick in her hand. And she also went, like, rose up through the ranks and caught hold of the person who was responsible for this, and kind of basically gave him a piece of her mind. But I think that if I had to take away Muthulakshmi and her personality from this book, I think this is the thing that I think I remember the most, because like she will do anything it takes for what she believes in, which is quite amazing, because she's literally, and she's not young at this point, right? She's, I don't know, 60, 70, and she's just overnight with that stick in her hand and ready to shoo away all these guys. I thought that was incredible, actually. Yeah.
I totally second that. And I think what was really interesting was even when the numbers grew, the way she kind of addressed it, and she had arms open to kind of welcome people across, and how she kind of managed to set this home up by itself, just with 3 knocking on the door to 50 and then over plus. I totally agree with Anushka. I think that she, towards the end of the chapter, just felt like she was very inspirational to a lot of aspects and perspectives of life, in spite of having a lot in the plate for herself.
Also, the fact that she not only wanted to make the people who came to the Abhay home, she not only wanted to make them literate, but also self-reliant. And she inspired them in such a way that they insisted on, giving back the money that they were spent on for their training. That I found was amazing, because uh, to make others think that they have to give back to the society, you need strong, she would have been such a powerful instrument in their lives that they thought that they should give back to. So that was something I found really interesting. And also the account of uh, Krishnamurti saying that most of Amma's debates and speeches were discussed, and many ideas were given by Appa. And I found that interesting as well. I mean, that happens at everybody. It became so personal that all those anecdotes made it so personal, because everything we do, we discuss at home. And, it's like you have a mini mock debate within the family. All those accounts were beautiful. And I think the reference of how, I'm sorry, the reference of how in Silapadigaram as well, once the courtesan performed publicly, she had there was a chance that she could be bought by a patron, and how that was um, related to Ramamirtamamma. I found that interesting. But I think it says that a girl who had been dedicated to a temple through the ritual of Bottukattadal had to be prepared for the man to abandon her at any time. So even though she was assigned a man, he could abandon her at any time. And so through her skills, she had to, make up, and she needed all the skills she could muster to keep him devoted to her. I mean, that was sad, but a very strong image that I found in the Devadasi question chapter.
Yeah, I totally agree, Maitri. And I think that this is where the author like really has till now given us context into the person Muthulakshmi is, what her aspirations are. Not even aspirations, actually. It's aspiration seems like a word normal people like we'd use, but for her it's like you decide something and then like find a way to make it happen, you know? So so yeah, I think this also calls out I think the superficiality in the way we'd normally understand the Devadasi system, to say that, okay, the Nitya Sumangalis means that you're auspicious, and because you're auspicious, you're well respected, and there aren't really as many issues, or rather, the issues that the Devadasi had are not practical issues that are real that they're facing, but it's instead something to be debated on. And then there's this question of art versus, so I think that this is another aspect where they really bring that out, is what I think. And also I wanted to share that I just googled while Maitri was speaking, the like what the Avai home looks like today, because these are institutions that even during the writing of the book, it becomes clear that they're strong institutions and they really have survived the test of time. So I think Muthulakshmi was also super strategic in what she did. And it says that I'll send this article link here. It says that sorry, I'll copy it. It says that this Avai home, all of them have, as of May 2023, the class 12th batch of students have 100% pass percentage despite them being dropouts from other private schools. So it's still I mean, I'm not from Chennai, but probably whoever's from Chennai knows of Avai home, but it still looks like it's a very important institution today. And regarding what Maitreyi said about the fact that she would debate all of these fiery speeches on the legislative assembly floor would actually be discussions at home, and some of these ideas came from her husband. I thought that was amazing because the perception that we get from the rest of the book, and she's making such strong arguments, is that she is naturally talented and she believes in what she does. But no, she's equally meticulous. And I mean, as dancers, we also get that, what appears on stage or at the end of the day, we know how much work we've done behind the scenes to perfect it. And it seems like this was true for her as well. She wasn't she may or may not have been naturally great at it, but she did the legwork and made sure that, she doesn't, there's no lack of effort to get those outcomes that she really wanted. I thought that's what struck out to me. Yeah.
I think it's so commendable how she's done so much in her lifetime and set such a strong foundation that even like many groups and governments haven't been able to do in like one, I guess, generation. So I think that's it's like very laudable. I can't even imagine doing something like that, or at least one of the things that she did. So I thought that was very interesting. But I wanted to go back to what Lakshmi said. I just wanted to clarify what you said, Lakshmi. Were you talking about the structure of how we practice like Ardavus and the Alaripu? Were you talking about how that came about? Because I also was thinking about that as well. I kind of wonder where this whole like Margam and repertoire was set and how it came about to be. I know some like the Ardavus and the basic things of dance comes from the Natya Shastra, which was like way before, but exactly like how the structure has stayed throughout so many years, I wonder if that's also from this lineage as well. So if you don't mind clarifying what you said earlier.
I think the first recorded evidence that we have for like the Ardavas that we practice in the Margam today, so like Vattatadava and Uttradava, the site of Ardavas, it comes from so there was it comes from Tulaja, who was a king in the Nayaka period in Tanjavur. So that's where that comes from, and I think that's about the 17th century. And then everything else, the Alarib Judishwaram in the format that we have today, so Alarib Tilana, that also comes from around the same time period, and it was codified by Tanjavur Quartet, which is again later in the 19th century. So practically most of the repertoire that we practice today, substantially it comes from here. And I guess Natya Shastra was an influential text in this period, but it was largely forgotten. So as a text, it was only rediscovered by Oriental scholars later again in the 19th century. So yes, there's no direct, like for instance, if we open up the Natya Shastra, we cannot find like direct evidence for any of the repertoire or even the Ardavas in the way we practice it today. So that was what I was referring to. So when we think about this whole time period as a degeneration of what the tradition that was, that to me struck me as, it didn't fully make sense to me, because almost everything that we practice today and that we take today comes from this supposed period of degeneration in their practice. So that was what it's referring to.
I think to add on, there's with respect to the Natya Shastra, the equivalent of Adavus are Karanas. So they are series of movements. And the Adava that we have today is very linear and very, like very angled and structured like that. But the Karanas are mostly just graceful movements. And the shift from uh, the basic movements of Karanas to Adavas, I think has been attempted there's a comparison of Karanas to Adava by Dr. Padma Subramanian. There's a book that she's written on this, where the Adavas that probably might be similar to some of the Karanas, the earlier known Karanas, are mentioned, but there's also a mention that the Adavas that we see around the period of the Tanjore Quartet, there's an earlier set of Adavas that are mentioned in another earlier text, to which Dr. Padma Subramaniam connects that she says that probably from these Karanas, these isolated Adavus might have evolved. So I think that would be a very interesting read as well.
Yeah, I have to read that because I remember when I was really young, I saw a video on YouTube of a documentary that Dr. Padma Subramaniam did, and it was explaining like the karanas and eye movements and everything. So I thought that was very cool. But I have to read this text. So
Just want to go back to your point, when you said the quote. You know how she writes about the woman being abandoned, that the patron could abandon the Devadasi at any given point. I was also just thinking about perhaps the way marriage was conceived then. The concept of a divorce was not really there, provisions for it. And even now it's pretty like the percentage is pretty low in India. So, I mean, and we go back to Nagaratnama, we see her mother being abandoned by her patron, and that's what prompts their move to Mysore to start with. I'm wondering how much of this was this a lack of agency on the part of the Devadasi herself, and that she was controlled by a man who could abandon her at any time, who didn't have responsibility for her children? Or was this again another choice that she was free to make at any point, that she could choose to sever the relationship with her patron and choose who she wanted to be with?
So the way that I interpreted that was that again, the way this is also one of those points that I think made me understand how flawed my understanding of this was, which is that, you say that, okay, this is Devadasis are women that follow a matriarchal lineage and they have agency and they don't need to be married or confined to a certain, Victorian moral code of conduct. But I think this is where they say that this abandonment argument is, I think, an argument to say that this thing that we see as a fact, which is in fact telling us that the Devadasis were independent women, was not something that made them independent, but rather, like the author says, because out of fear of not fear, out of just very practical reasons that your patron would possibly might abandon you, they would have to, up their game in terms of the skills that they had and keep their options open and things like this. So I think that it was actually a forced uh, setup that they were in, and they had no choice but to do this. So I after reading this, I would think that they're not, I mean, they have an artificial sense of agency, which it's very easy for us as, modern women, modern feminists to say it's amazing that they had that kind of sense of agency. But I think two things is, one, that came with an equivalent amount of discrimination and stigma, like Bhargavi spoke about, and also practical concerns in terms of health and livelihood. But the second thing is that this this illusion of choice that they had was not actually choice. It was, I think, what they were forced to do, and it's not a dignified situation for them to have been in. So that was Muthulakshmi's reasoning to go against it. That's how I would understand it.
Also, on a general note, I think of the chance of a patron abandoning her and remarrying at for a long period of time. Polygamy only was is associated with respect to the man marrying many people and not the woman. I think the only thing I can think of is the arguments that came across when Panchali had to marry 5 men. And that was a lot of discussion and a lot of, how can that happen? But for kings, for them to, like expand their kingdom, they could marry as many princesses as they wanted. And if the wife couldn't bear a child, any normal man could remarry as if it was licensed to remarry. I think that has been the practice and the idea that the society at large, thought was right, that polygamy uh, worked. And it's like how we say, the, the birth, I mean, how they used to think that the birth of a girl child was the fault of the woman. Everywhere there was a lot of hurdles and sticks for us to cross than compared to men. And I think with regardless of the caste and the community, the Devadasis also had similar issues.
Yeah, and just a thought on the Nagaratnama chapter, which uh, I think that, honestly, like compared to like the amount of material that was there to think about and that leaves an impression on the reader's mind in these two specific chapters on the Muthulakshmi Reddy, probably there was this chapter was more of a historical telling of like what happened. But yeah, I think that one thing that kind of evoked some feelings in me was that it said that the 50th death anniversary of Nagaratnama passed by unnoticed in 2002. It would appear that everyone had forgotten the sacrifices of the woman that had made sure to ensure Tyagaraja's Samadhi became a worthy memorial to him. It was, and then he says it was in that year that I made up my mind to pen a biography of Nagaratnama. So I think that this chapter, again, I don't remember all the little facts because it was quite, I think, fact dense. But yeah, like uh, Lakshmi said in her intro, I think a lot of it was about how so many things. She was a woman who had a vision for the future in terms of how Tyagaraja. She would like Tyagaraja to be remembered and how the memorial and the trust would like to be, and she took these steps towards it. Towards it, but that did not pan out very well because the trustees started passing away, and then it became a question of um, propagation after her time was over. And I think that the way it ended with this moment where they say, the 50th death anniversary, nobody remembers her. I thought that, yeah, that was quite, yeah, I mean, after all that she had done, it was not interesting, but uh, yeah, the only word that I can come up with is interesting right now. But she did all of that work, but she didn't really get the recognition for it. I think that is the main takeaway for me from that chapter, I think.
That's so true. And then after all she did through her life, both to she fought for equity in her own way, Muthulakshmi Reddy in hers, in seeking to abolish the system in which she very proudly announced this and sought to preserve aspects of it while making changes in other places, like bringing in women into the Aradhana, and then how that ended in with the fact that she wasn't really given the recognition in that. I think it would also be interesting to see how the Aradhana continued after her and why perhaps that was lost, what the role of women after that has been, and how that evolved, and why perhaps her voice was lost in this process. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, or rather, I think that for me, until the reading of this book, I mean, we know of the Tyagaraja Aradhana. We know that it's the monumental occasion in the, I mean, for a Rasika or for, a student of music. And I think that's the only case where, you have so many people, leading from the more senior musician to to an interested, invested student of music sitting on a large stage, but a common stage, and paying their respects to this great composer. I think that there was one year where I think during Nagaratnama's efforts towards making the Tyagaraja Aradhana memorable and increasing women's participation in it, that actually people start singing together versus, slots being given out. And I think that, the Tyagaraja Aradhana in Tiruvayur, but also across the world, I think she definitely has a contribution and, an impact that we must recognize today. But honestly, until I read this book, I didn't know that she had such a huge part to play in it. So, yeah.
In the last few lines of the 10th chapter, the writings of Malan, where he says, kings worshipped him, musicians sang his songs, and it was a courtesan that built a temple for him. So that was a very befitting quote to end on, to end the book on. Yeah, I definitely had no idea of the influence that women can have on a society and the music world. Yeah, it was just mind blowing to me.
But have any other concluding thoughts or reflections on the chapter? Thank you so much for joining us this week, and we'll see you again next week.